welcome back. And my name again is René. I use he, him pronouns. One thing I just wanted to share is that in addition to teaching meditation, the other thing that I do these days is I'm a restorative justice facilitator, and I work with an organization called the Ahimsa Collective, and we facilitate healing conversations when there has been harm. Conflict less so. We often actually work with specifically violent crimes, including people who've been murdered, killed by drunk drivers. We work in the area also of sexual harm. So it's been something I've been doing for a couple of years, and it's I'm actually teaching a class that's coming up in September around kind of bringing together some of, well, actually more transformative justice principles with Dharma. So my friend Don Haney and I are going to be teaching a class that really is bringing together what we've been learning over the last couple of years around transformative justice principles with Dharma practice. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I'll drop a link in the chat for that. But I really have been interested, as we've been preparing for this class, in bringing together some of the work that I do in the restorative justice world with Dharma, and kind of share a little bit about how that comes together in me. And I wanted to, just as I'm using these terms, restorative justice, transformative justice, to define those a little bit, or at least as I'll define them as kind of, it's been showing up for me, and I think you might find different definitions. People might give different definitions than I would, but I will say, for me, restorative justice is work that often happens around bringing more of a healing approach to harm that is counter to a punitive system. So, a punitive system would be like, we need to incarcerate people, punish them. A restorative approach is, let's bring some healing where there's been harm through dialogue, through bringing the people who have been harmed and those who've done harm together with support people to try and bring some healing. And that often happens in institutional settings, and often happens with like professional facilitators like myself. And then I think of transformative justice as more what happens in relationships and community when we bring that same approach of like a healing approach when there's been harm, as opposed to a punitive approach. And in this case, we're really thinking about, how do we embed this in our relationships, our communities, our networks of relationships. So I think of restorative justice as something I do like in a professional way, and transformative justice is what I do in my life. This is how I am working to be accountable in my own life, to be accountable, for instance, as a meditation teacher, to be accountable within my relationships, and to have people in my life who hold me accountable, who I actually have go to if I am concerned I may have done harm, or if someone lets me know that something I did impacted them. I have support people in my life who I can work with and get support from when I've done some harm or impacted somebody, and also who I can get support from when I have felt harmed or impacted. So that it's really like bringing accountability into our daily lives and relationships. So that's how I think about it, and other people may have other definitions, but I just wanted to share that. And the class that we're doing that's coming up in September is going to be focused on accountability, conflict, boundaries, and feedback. And Dawn and I were actually teaching in July, maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago at Alphabet, and talked a bit about all of these topics. We did like kind of a quick teaser for the class. And tonight I wanted to focus a little bit more on boundaries, and particularly getting into practicing with boundaries and consent, because I don't know, we'll get somewhat into consent in the class, but thought this would be a chance to explore that a little bit more. It's definitely a place where I feel like my own practice or mindfulness intersects with some of these ideas around transformative justice. I feel like the work of boundaries, of like maintaining my own boundaries and respecting other people's boundaries, as well as the work of consent, of like really knowing my own limits and making requests and like honoring other people's limits and feeling into whether I can meet their requests, is like this very ongoing way that I bring mindfulness practice into relationships. So I wanted to focus specifically on that piece tonight. And to like get into that, I want to share just a piece, a quote from the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Buddha's teachings on what's often called the four foundations of mindfulness. So it's a very foundational text in insight meditation, insight tradition of Buddhism. And I feel like I've brought this into Alphabet many times before. It's a quote that I come back to over and over again. And I think I first read this sutta when I was doing the Commit to Dharma program with Larry Yang back in maybe 2010 or so. I remember reading this sutta for the first time, and this piece that I'm going to read to you was something that just had a big impact on me, and something I feel like I was like, wow, I don't even understand what this says, but I want to really explore this piece of what is being shared here. So this is something that's like referred to as the refrain within the sutta. In the sutta, it goes through the four foundations of mindfulness, which are mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of thoughts or mind objects, and mindfulness of dharmas, which is like kind of how things are. And within that are a whole bunch of other lists of different teachings, actually. So, but this piece of the sutta reads, in this way, in regard to the body, they abide contemplating the body internally, contemplating the body externally, and contemplating the body both internally and externally. So this is like a really, this recurs over and over again in this sutta, in this basic teaching about mindfulness and mindfulness as a way, a path for liberation. I thought it was really interesting that this is being brought up over and over again in this text, really pointing to our mindfulness practice not being something that we just do with ourselves. You know, it's saying we're going to be bringing our mindfulness practice to our body internally, or it might be bringing our mindfulness practice to mindfulness of thoughts or mindfulness of feelings. This would recur in all of those sections. We're contemplating the body internally, which is to say, I'm reading that as my own body. We're also contemplating the body externally, which I'm reading that as other people's bodies, like other people's thoughts, other people's feelings, other people's experience, and then contemplating the body both internally and externally, which is to say, actually doing both at the same time. And I think when I first learned about that, I was like, whoa, how could that even be possible? And I think there's been a number of different practices I've learned over the years that start to open up this possibility of actually both, of being both mindful of my own experience and mindfulness of someone else's experience, and both at the same time. And there's some practices like insight dialogue, if people are familiar with that get also to this, very directly to this experience of both being with our own experience and with the experience of another person. But I think another great example of how we can be both with our own experience and with the experience of another person actually is in the practice of boundaries and consent. Because that is those are places where we're very actively navigating our experience and someone else's experience and being mindful of both at the same time. So, if I am in, like, just to use an example, this happens a lot to me right now because we're in COVID, I'll see a friend and they'll say, would you like a hug? We're all kind of like, a little bit tentative about even offering it. But I really appreciate that because sometimes hugs are something that I don't experience as consensual. So it's been nice with COVID times that we actually, now we all ask. And, so my friend might ask me, oh, would it be okay if I give you a hug? And then I get a chance to say, yes, I'd love a hug. Or I could have a chance to say, you know what, I don't actually feel comfortable today with a hug. Whether I set a limit or have an enthusiastic yes or whatever it might be, it's actually this moment where we're kind of meeting each other's experience. One person has a request, the other person gets to say yes or no, or maybe later. And we're really like bringing our awareness to the experience of both of our like bodies, feelings in that moment. So I think it's like this very concrete way of practicing with the experience of self and other simultaneously. I wanted to share a really beautiful quote, and I also may have shared this before in this group, from Prentice Hemphill, who is a somatics practitioner and teacher, particularly with the movement for Black Lives. Prentice says, boundaries are the distance at which I could love me and you simultaneously. So this is, again, really like resonating with this idea of being both with my own experience, loving myself, really attending to my own needs and limits, as well as loving the other person and attending to their limits, needs, caring for that person. So I feel like Prentice is saying sort of the same thing the Buddha was saying in a different way. And also really inviting into that practice of what is the distance, or what are the limits, or what are the, the needs for us, for me to both love myself and love someone else. And with each person, of course, that will be different. And it's such a beautiful practice. It's just like, I feel like that's such a beautiful invitation into practice and awareness of both self and other. I recently got, before I put it away, this book on the Satipatthana Sutta has really been a touchstone for me, and it's the Venerable Analayo. It's like this commentary on the sutta. And that's something that's like, it's been a touchstone for me. But I also wanted to share this book. It just came out, Adrienne Ray Brown's Holding Change. And there's a short chapter from Prentice Hemphill about boundaries in this book. And I just wanted to read this another quote from Prentice. So Prentice says, boundaries are responsive, movable, and highly dependent on real-time assessments. Boundaries are how you guide and protect your life energy. The skillful use of boundaries allow us to create proximity, intimacy, distance. So I think the thing that I love that Prentice is pointing to in this quote is the way that actually boundaries are constantly changing. It's not like we meet that friend and we say, I never want a hug. Or I always want hugs. We're always going to be checking back in to say, today, how is it? Today I'm like, yes, I want a hug. A week from now, I might be like, you know what? I had some sniffles today, so I'm not going to hug. And that's going to be constantly changing. And, I also want to point to the thing that I think comes up in this quote from Prentice is that boundaries are a way that we're both inviting people in as well as setting limits. So, the boundaries, we often think of them as the limits, the things that we don't want to do, but they're also something that places where we can invite in more intimacy. Like it's really actually a condition for intimacy. And that piece of inviting in is a part of the boundary as well. It can be like, actually, my boundaries right now are very close in. I want that much contact. Or it can be like, nope, my boundaries are more out here. And I'm, not wanting that much closeness. So it's so flexible, but it is really like attuning to our own needs and limits as well as those of others. And I wanted to bring in just how consent is also weaves in with this. In some ways, there's similarity between talking about boundaries and talking about consent. And one definition I found helpful for consent is that it's the embodied ability to be self-responsive, assess situations, and hold what you and others care about. It's the ability to choose. So that's like kind of pointing again to the same thing we were talking about with boundaries, that it's, attending to our own needs and what we care about, attending to other people's needs and what they care about, and making choices about that for us, making our own choices, but also respecting other people's choices. I'm going to put in the chat just while we're talking about Prentice. Prentice has a podcast that I definitely recommend. So if you want to learn more about Prentice, I just dropped a link in the chat. Then I also wanted to share a really great resource that I have found around to learn more about consent. And this is someone named Dr. Betty Martin, and she actually just came out with a new book. I always like to share the books that I'm reading. I'm just like on chapter 4. So this is The Art of Receiving and Giving. And so I haven't actually read the whole thing because I just got it. But I have also checked out a bunch of resources that Betty Martin has online, and I just dropped that in the chat. And one, so she talks about something called the Wheel of Consent. And this is based in a practice. She calls it a game. The 3-minute game is actually developed by Harry Faddis as part of the Body Electric School. It was based here in the Bay Area. So folks who've been around a long time, especially in gay male culture, might remember Body Electric. And I think it's still around, and did, taught folks around consent. And so this was developed out of that. And then Betty Martin has sort of refined it from there. And in this practice, which you would do with another person, there's each person kind of makes 2 offers. And so it goes in 2 directions, which results in 4 possible pieces of this game. One is that you ask someone how they would like to be touched. And then you would ask them to touch you in a way that you would like to be touched. And then the other person will do the same. Ask you how you would like to be touched and ask you to touch them in the way that they would like to be touched. And what's really interesting and kind of breaking it apart into these 4 pieces is it really it just like starts to show how complex consent actually can be. Even just taking apart the piece of like, I'm going to touch you in the way that you want to be touched versus you might ask me to touch you in the way that you want to be touched. Even just this like taking apart even what is the idea of giving and receiving? And sometimes we really conflate these into the same, or we might make assumptions about what it is that somebody wants in terms of contact. And this may also apply to things that are not about physical contact at all. But I think that she really does an amazing job at sort of teasing apart, some of our conditioning that's built into why we might, for instance, allow or put up with a kind of contact that we don't really like, or offer someone something that they don't actually want because we may just assume that it is what we should do or what we think that they want. And, so it's more than just bringing our language and words to the negotiation around touch and contact. It's actually really pulling apart what's underneath that. So just something, if folks are interested in learning more around consent, Betty Martin is a really great resource. And I think, her 3-minute game is another place where it's really bringing our mindfulness, bringing our awareness to the experience of contact with another person. And we can also do that with ourselves. I know, for some of us right now, we're still in the pandemic and having really limited physical contact with other people. And it's something that you can also tune. She has a practice of really just doing this exercise with yourself. And in some ways is part of what I was guiding in the meditation of bringing touch to ourselves and feeling both the part of offering ourselves that touch as well as tuning into receiving that touch. And so we can even tune into that distinction within our contact with ourselves. It doesn't require another person to be feeling into those differences of offering and receiving contact.